Welcome to Tourism Talk. I'm Laura Oswald, Director of Marketing at the Paducah Visitors Bureau. Today, I have my director, Mary Hammond, and a very special guest, Christopher Merrill, Director of the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Thank you all for joining us today.
Nice to be with you.
Glad to be here.
Now, Chris Merrill has a great connection to Paducah through the Creative Cities Network in Iowa City as his home. So it's really hard to even sum up all of your background and connections, and I think that we should maybe give you a chance to talk about how you connected first with Paducah and through UNESCO.
Well, as the director of the International Writing Program, it fell to me to lead the charge for Iowa City to become the first UNESCO City of Literature in the New World. And one of the wonderful side benefits of that is that I was there when Mary and her colleagues were starting to put together Paducah's bid to join the Creative Cities Network, and we became friends during the course of that application process. And then, because we both serve on the National Commission, we get to see each other once a year at the annual meeting in Washington, and now it's a thrill to finally enjoy Paducah at this place that I have been thinking about for so many years.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about why you're here at this time shortly. But Mary, it is such an honor that now you do serve on the U.S. National Commission with Chris, and you've been so instrumental in Paducah's role in the Creative Cities Network. Touch a little bit on that from your perspective.
The UNESCO Creative Cities Network has just been such an open door for Paducah to work with like-minded cities around the globe. How exciting it is when we answer the phone, you've done it yourself, Laura, only to have a call from the other side of the world, someone who wants to work with us. I think of just when you answered the phone and it was Bologna, saying they had an independent music group that was going to South by Southwest, and they were interested in seeing some other parts of America. Could they come to Paducah? So they ended up coming back a second time, 2 sold-out shows in Paducah. We've worked with Bologna a couple of times, and our friends in Fabriano, and oh my gosh, just across the globe, and just a way to the creativity, the depth of the culture and the creativity and the innovation, and how that all ties together with our cities and our goals. And then learning with the UNESCO and the 2030 goals, and seeing that here we have an international organization, and our personal goals here in Paducah, they mirror the 2030 goals across the globe. So we're working towards common goals, and if all the smaller cities, big cities, if we work together to reach those goals, we can do that. And preserving our culture, which is so important. We know who we are, that we're just not just an exit on the interstate, but that our culture is part of who we are on a daily basis. And I think that UNESCO has given us a platform as a community to learn our own stories and to help tell them.
And preserve them.
Preserve them, yes.
Absolutely. And I think that Paducah's role as a city of crafts and folk art, Iowa Cities as a city of literature, there are those creative fields, but there are so many similarities. And you mentioned smaller cities, Iowa City, Paducah, similar size cities. What is the value that you see in that, Chris, after traveling internationally and working through this network?
Well, it's fun to be in another city along a river. Iowa City received its designation only months after surviving a devastating flood that did about $1 billion worth of damage to the city. And in the year or two after that flood, when we had just joined the Creative Cities Network, I had really interesting conversations with people from cities of design, because we were starting to rethink what the city would look like. We're in the midst of what may be about a 20-year construction boom in the rebuilding of our Performing Arts Center, our art museum, our theater building, our music building, and we've enlisted some of the top architects around the world. And so Iowa City is changing its very face. And we're doing that in some ways in conjunction with the development of this UNESCO Creative City. So as Mary said, we're in contact with really creative people around the world who face similar issues. Paducah had its own flood longer ago, thank God, than ours. But you know something about the rebuilding of a city, and that means the revisioning of what a city might be.
I think that's a great example of that it isn't just literature or crafts and folk art, that creativity is really permeating our culture of our cities, and this is a means to connect with other like-minded cities, as Mary said.
And to that end, I've mentioned this story before, but we have each creative city has a mentoring obligation to other aspirant cities, and Iowa City, Paducah are small cities, but in the course of my work in cultural diplomacy, I go to a lot of places of strategic interest to the U.S. State Department. I've spent a fair amount of time in Baghdad, and I remember being in a meeting with their Deputy Minister of Culture some years ago and having a little light went off in my brain that Baghdad, big city, with a very rich history of literary, intellectual, and artistic production. Of course, over the last 50 years, it's just been obliterated in so many ways, but I thought to build on that tradition might be a useful way to think about how we rebuild a city and a civilization. And when I mentioned this to the deputy minister, he said, my mind is churning with ideas, because I think he could see that in the wake of a devastating war and also a civil war, concentrating on the creative aspects of the city, concentrating on writing, on literature, might be a way to bring together Shia and Sunni, Christian, Arabs and Kurds, a way to create a different narrative about where Baghdad will go from here on out. Baghdad got into the Creative Cities Network, and their very energetic director is just doing one thing after another, reaching out to cities around the world, trading best practices, generating literary ideas and collaborations. That's how things move forward.
Absolutely. Mary, I would love for you to share with our viewers how you tell a similarly aligned narrative about Paducah and building upon our history as a river city.
Let's see. I always tell the story of Paducah being the 15th state. We came in with Maine. So you had your original colonies, and those were pretty brave people, but now you had this next generation that was ready to improve their life, to seek their fortune, to find more place for growth and expansion for their own ideas. So they came down the Ohio River and through the Cumberland Gap. So they came through Kentucky. We've always been a pass-through state, but those people who came through left pieces of themselves. And so we've always had a visionary state, an adventuresome state moving forward, that these folks left a little bit of themselves. And it's, of course, I liken it with the quilting, you didn't bring much fabric with you when you were traveling, except what you had on and maybe a few other pieces. But you used every piece of that and took scraps together to make a blanket and added layers for warmth. And of course you were interpreting your stories and patterns and things that you remembered from the old world and your stitches that maybe your grandmother taught you. So you see that culture of new and inventing new, but still using your old assets and your old memory, but continuing to grow on that. And I see UNESCO very much that way. You want to preserve those traditions that are in your family, but you also want to build on those innovation and creativity to take your culture. And I think we're all in a very good place in which to do that.
Very much so. I love the way you talk about people passing through, because think of Mark Twain's Life and Times on the Mississippi,
yes,
which is such a great book. And when I bring the visiting writers to the International Writing Program to the Mississippi, sometimes we bring them to Hannibal just to see how that river has informed all of our lives. There's a rich tradition of river writing in this country.
Yes, there is.
There is. Speaking of the International Writing Program, tell us a bit more about your role with that and what that program is all about.
Well, the International Writing Program grows out of the very famous Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa. And the man who ran the workshop for about 25 years, toward the end of his tenure, had started traveling more, bringing international writers to Iowa City, one of whom was a well-known Chinese novelist, Nie Waling, who had been born on the mainland. Her father was killed by the communists in the revolution in 1948, so her family moved to Taiwan, where she found herself out of favor with the nationalist government there. And on a cultural diplomacy mission in the early 60s, Paul Engel met her at a reception. I think he fell in love with her at first sight, and eventually she came to Iowa. When he retired from the workshop, she said to him, "Why don't you start an international writing program?" He thought this was the craziest idea he had ever heard, and then the two of them set about creating just that. This was 50 years ago. And so what we've done over these 50 years is to bring distinguished writers from around the world, over 1,400 writers now from 170 countries.
Wow.
They're poets and fiction writers, nonfiction writers, playwrights, filmmakers. They come to Iowa for 3 months and they engage in what we call a robust exchange. They write, they give readings, they give panel discussions, and then we take them to other places in the country. They might go to New Orleans or to Seattle or San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and Washington. And we say to them on the first day that their main priority is to write. But what I'm also hoping is that by the end of their time here, they will have accumulated many more pages of writing, many impressions of this country and other literary traditions, and many new friends. And so over 50 years, that's what we've been doing. We say the world comes to Iowa, and then Iowa goes out into the world.
That's wonderful. I think that really maybe informs your cultural diplomacy efforts.
Exactly, yeah.
I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that and give our viewers some perspective on how culture can be a tool for bridging divides.
Well, for a very long time, every country practices cultural diplomacy in some form or another. Sometimes it's called soft power or smart power. But every country wants to communicate its most enduring values, what it treasures about itself. In Paducah, the tradition of making quilts is something that we treasure. So in one way or another, we try to engage in that exchange of information and ideas, usually people-to-people exchanges. And unfortunately, in this country, we have we kind of do it for a while and then we stop doing it. In the early 1990s, the government did away with the whole cultural diplomacy apparatus. You remember things like the peace dividend. Clinton and Gore called this part of the reinventing government, but they essentially cashiered a lot of diplomats. 9/11 came along, and everyone was saying, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? And one of the things that was going on at the time was we had stopped communicating who we are to the world. And that means our writers, that means our artists, that means our musicians, jazz and blues, and all the ways in which American artists, composers, dancers have shaped the world in their own images. So I was part of part of my task was to rebuild this idea of cultural diplomacy. I did a report for the State Department on that, and we started thinking about the international writing program not just as a place where the world comes to Iowa, but as a two-way exchange with the rest of the world. And we started to bring American writers out to places of strategic interest to meet other writers, students, editors, cultural figures, communicate something about what we do as artists, and learn something about what they do, so that in that exchange, new ideas might be created. And in my case, it's allowed me to go to a lot of interesting, sometimes complicated places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Iran and Libya and Syria and a lot of places that are often in the news. But it's given me a chance to see up close what life is like, and then in some cases I get to write about it and try to turn that into books.
Absolutely. I think that ties right into your memoir and the reason that you're here. You talk about Dogwood Diplomacy, with the theme of your book being the dogwood tree.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about how this came to be Self-Portrait with Dogwood.
Well, it's a funny story because some years ago an editor told me she was starting a new series called The Life of Trees, and did I want to write one of the books? And I said immediately, without thinking, Dogwoods, because I love dogwood trees, so I got a contract. I started writing the book. The series came to nothing. The other writers she lined up didn't really produce what she wanted, but mine kind of caught fire, and I had the chance in the act of writing this book to think about all the ways in which at formative moments in my life there was always a dogwood in the background, from the one in our backyard, on the lowest branch of which I sat on the day that John F. Kennedy was buried. And I was just a little kid. There was no school. The image endured in my imagination. And from there I started going through my whole life, from high school and college, and learning to be a writer, and then eventually working in a nursery and as a caretaker in New Mexico, and then starting to travel around the world. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia for 3.5 years and wrote a couple of books about that. But in the process of that, found myself thinking, how am I going to make sense of all of the tragedy that I witnessed? And one of the ways was wandering in the woods after a day of writing back in, at that point, in Portland, Oregon. And eventually that led on to my work in cultural diplomacy. And you mentioned Dogwood Diplomacy. One story that I have toward the end of the book is just at the end of Secretary Clinton's tenure in the State Department, almost the last thing she did was to reciprocate a gift given 100 years before. All the cherry trees in blossom in Washington, D.C. now come from the 3,000 cherry trees donated to the U.S. in 1912 by the Japanese government. We never formally reciprocated the gift because the president at the time was leaving office. Then with the rising militarism in Japan and World War II and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it just never happened. In 2012, as part of the pivot to Asia, Secretary Clinton made the decision to reciprocate the gift, to give 3,000 dogwoods to the Japanese government. This was also in the wake of the tragedy of the nuclear reactor meltdown at Fukushima. And so I started to write about that. It gave me a chance to talk about soft power diplomacy. Also gave me a chance to find out some of the ins and outs of trying to get dogwoods to Japan on a very short notice, and it's not so easy. But so I took that as a way to talk about that larger issue of soft power cultural diplomacy.
The stories in the book are so inspiring, that and woven throughout your entire life. And of course, when Paducah sees that the Dogwood were involved, Mary was quick to reach out and invite you to Paducah for the Dogwood Trail Celebration.
Well, I had the chance to wander, to drive along the Dogwood Trail last night to see the dogwoods in full blossom and lit up. My gosh, it's so beautiful. And I was thinking of a poem I translated a long time ago by the Mexican poet Jaime Sabines, which goes, I might have found you 10 years earlier or 10 years later, but you got here just in time. And last night I thought, I've gotten here just in time to see these clouds of white all around the city. It's indescribably beautiful.
And that lighted Dogwood Trail that you mentioned has been a tradition for 53 years now. Mary, speak a little bit to the Dogwood Trail's significance in our community.
It is something that binds us together and gives us community pride. And I love that the dogwoods, the people make a point to plant a dogwood in your house, in your yard. If people are buying a home, they plant a dogwood. And so the dogwood may have an official trail, but as we've seen as we've peered down different side streets, that the dogwoods are throughout the city. And the azaleas and all the accompanying beautiful plantings that go along with it. So it has been something that has brought us together and given us great community pride. And it's been a good thing. And so, and then when I read the title of your memoir and started reading about it, the description, and how dogwoods have been a part of your life through most every phase, I thought, well, we're about to add another chapter.
Yeah,
so,
we certainly have.
And we're glad to have your Dogwood Diplomacy here in Paducah. And thank you for sharing and all of the activities that you're doing within our community, from designating your own award as part of the Dogwood Trail, from going to the creative writing class at Paducah Tillman and here at the college with the creative writing class, Dean Shirley's class, and just participating in open mic at Silent Brigade, to the art school, to Audible art show at Yeiser Art Center. It's a busy time, but it's also indicative of any week of Paducah, life in Paducah, the activities that are happening throughout the cultural world here in our town is very exciting.
It's always the case, if you dig even a little bit, you find out there's so much going on. And I remember I had a teacher in graduate school who said, you know, when you're driving across Montana and you get bored, what you should do is just get out of your car for about 10 minutes and sit there, and you will find out that the world is really rich. And this is really a rich place.
It is. I have to say, I think this is a special place for me. Iowa City is a very special place. But we're all America. We're not that different.
No,
it's
no.
just a matter of what we're doing with and how we're presenting it and involving our people. And I'm proud that Paducah is attempting to involve the community in preserving their culture for the future and tapping their creativity and innovation. To look at a sustainable future. There are lots of great ideas, but we've got to be sustainable while keeping our identity.
Exactly.
And that's our goals. And of course, we're in tourism, and we need something to sell. And our culture is our greatest seller here, through quilting, the creative crafts and handwork that happen in our community. But yeah, it's, so we stretch the bounds of tourism in order to enrich our product.
Yeah. It makes me think that in an early meeting in Baghdad with the steering committee for their bid, they said, but we don't teach creative writing. How are we going to make a bid?
Right.
And I said, well, look, we emphasized the teaching of creative writing because that's what we do in Iowa City.
Right.
I said, you've been a center of intellectual production for 1,500 years. You didn't need creative writing courses. Right. So you have to figure out what it is that you can offer to the Creative Cities Network. And I said, beginning with the fact that writing was invented in this very area. So I said, you have probably a pretty good story to tell. And in some ways, I think our job as mentors in the Creative Cities Network is to help individual cities figure out what their story is. And that's at the heart of selling what that place is all about.
Yes.
And that really ties into, as you said, inviting the world to Iowa City. We want to invite the world into Paducah and the culture here to be part of that. And that's where tourism has been such a good fit in our community. We certainly are inspired by your role.
Well, I've noticed that the photographs I took last night along the Dogwood Trail and put on Facebook, I said, along the Dogwood Trail in Paducah, Kentucky, after reading from my book, Self-Portrait with Dogwood, a lot of people like these photographs. And I think a lot of people are thinking, wow, Paducah looks pretty cool.
Yeah, the Creative Cities Network has been a door for us, as Mary
It really
said.
has. And I hope that we will work more closely together. We'd like to see some of those writers find their way to Kentucky, especially as Lexington and their application as a creative city of literature. And of course, we would love to see them part of the network. But you know what? Even if they're not, we're going to continue to work together in those great cities of literature in Oxford and Little Rock. I mean, the creativity around our area. And we've got cities that are even trying to decide what is their discipline. You know, how proud are we of Detroit with design?
Well, yeah, the designation of Detroit as a city of design in the wake of all the devastation the city has endured is a way to think about its future. Okay, as with Baghdad, a really bad run over the last 50 years. In Detroit, maybe the last 20, 30 years. But that doesn't mean that's the final chapter of the story. The next chapter is what gets interesting. And part of revitalizing a downtown part of revitalizing any area is recognizing the importance of the creative community. You get a place where you have a lot of writers or artists or quilt makers or you name it, and people begin to think that would be a cool place to live. Maybe I'll start a coffee shop, or maybe I'll build a new restaurant. The creative economy is in so many ways key to what will be most vibrant, I think, in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Yes, and it's definitely, the Creative Cities movement is definitely gaining momentum in the United States. As we all know, Santa Fe was the first creative city in the country, then Iowa City, then Paducah. And now that group of three has multiplied with Detroit, Austin, and Tucson. So we have such a diversity represented there geographically, creatively. The creative economy, it's great to hear you share your perspectives on that as well.
Well, I was particularly taken with the fact that Santa Fe got in because I was a caretaker there at a much earlier part in my life. And I remember learning a little bit about their history. They made a self-conscious decision in around 1910, the city council, to make sure that every house was adobe, because they thought then that this tiny little town might have some kind of a future if it could present itself in a certain way. Maybe it's even a kitschy way, but what happened was artists started migrating there. Georgia O'Keeffe, Mabel Dodge Lujan, then writers like Winfield Scott, and then more and more came. And then of course Hollywood figured out this was a good place to live, and the real estate values went up like crazy. But you can see, again, the evolution of an idea, and that's paying attention to the creatives is a good way to jumpstart any economy.
Yes.
Marfa, Texas is a great example. It was really a kind of forgotten little place. Then the Lannan Foundation bought a few cottages and established an artist residency. Artists went, writers went. Some liked it so much they thought, I might buy, the houses are cheap here, I might buy one. So a few more were bought. Then they built some restaurants and a coffee shop, a cafe. Now Marfa is really a hot place because somebody was creative enough to recognize that there was potential here and invited the artists in, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Culture, quality of life, becoming a stronger destination. It's all interconnected.
Exactly.
Just as our network. Thank you so much for being with us, Chris. We're so happy to have you in Paducah and to share your story. And I would definitely encourage our readers to learn more about the Creative Cities Network at our website, paducah.travel. You'll find a whole section there with connections to both Iowa City and the other U.S. cities and our international connections. And please do also check out Self-Portrait with Dogwood, Christopher Merrill, our distinguished guest today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Tourism Talk.
1, 2, 1, 2, go. Hello, ba-ba-da-ba-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. Hello, ba-ba-da-ba-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da.